Well, good afternoon. My name is Alexander Carpenter, and I'm the director of the Wirth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies here at the University of Alberta. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's event, the annual 2021 Toby and Saul Reichert Holocaust Lecture, which is part of our Fall Jewish Studies Week. I'm delighted you are joining us online, though of course, I think we had all hoped for an in-person event this fall. But nonetheless, I am looking forward to an extremely interesting and engaging lecture today, and I look forward to the Q&A session that is to follow. And I'll ask you to please post your questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we will reserve about 30 minutes for questions after the lecture is done. Today's lecture is made possible by the support of the broader Edmonton community, by our Reichert Holocaust Lecture Committee, who I would like to acknowledge. That's Dennis Sweeney, Jillian Horowitz, Leon Kagan, and Eric Schloss. And of course, by Mr. Saul and Mrs. Toby Reichert. Saul Reichert was born in Pabianice, Poland. He was 9 years old at the outbreak of the Second World War. Following the German occupation of their hometown, Saul's family home, business, and possessions were plundered, and they were forced to resettle in the Łódź ghetto. From there, they were eventually shipped to the notorious Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. Upon arrival, Saul was separated from his mother and sister and never saw them again. Saul managed to survive and was liberated by US troops in May of 1945. The Reicherts regard the Wirth Institute's lecture series as a way of keeping knowledge and understanding of the Holocaust alive among future generations of students, not only serving the purpose of commemorating the tragedy, but as a continuing, a cautionary epistle against such monumental injustices perpetrated on the innocent. Related to the mission of the Reichert Lecture, I would like to remind our audience that the Wirth Institute also hosts the Rudolf Verba Holocaust Reading Room, comprising several hundred curated volumes devoted to Holocaust studies. And there is a searchable index for this small library available online. And we certainly hope to be able to open our doors to interested readers again in the very near future. It remains for me to briefly introduce our speaker, and I'll be brief so we can get to the lecture, which is of course why we are all here. And I'm very pleased and very proud to introduce Dr. John Paul Himka as our 2021 Reichert Lecture speaker. Dr. Himka is, I suspect, well known to many of you. He is Professor Emeritus in History and Classics and Religion here at the University of Alberta, with a specialization in the history of Ukraine, Eastern Europe, and the Holocaust. He is the author of 5 books, including his most recent, Ukrainian Nationalists and the Holocaust, OUN and UPA's participation in the destruction of European Jewry, 1941 to 1944, published in 2021 by Insurgent Press. And he is also, alongside Dr. Franz Szabo, former director of the Wirth Institute, co-editor of Eastern Christians in the Habsburg Monarchy, also published in 2021 by CIUS Press. The title of today's lecture is Ukrainian Nationalists and the Holocaust. Please join me in welcoming Dr. John Paul Himka.
Thank you very much, Alex. I thank also the committee for inviting me to speak this year. And I know what kind of an honor this is because I have been on that committee and I have invited very important Holocaust scholars over the years. And for me to be on the same podium with them is really an honor. And the Wirth Institute has done wonderful work over the years. It is a great place to be speaking from. What I'm going to do is give a verbal tour of my recent book, which was mentioned there, which is, you can see it here in its mirror image. My book is on 2 organizations in Ukraine during the Holocaust. One is the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and then its armed force, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Both of these are known by their initials, OUN, but I always say it like we do in Ukraine, OUN. And the Ukrainian Insurgent Army has its Ukrainian initials as UPA. I say UPA. I hope from the context, those of you who missed or forgetting this will understand what I'm talking about. I'm not studying in this book how Ukrainians behaved during World War II or during the Holocaust. It's about an organization, not a nation. It's not about people in general, it's about an organization, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN. It's not a study of individual actions, it's an organizational study. I want to make that very clear because I'm not talking about Ukrainians in general or anything like that. I'm speaking about the record of an organization during one of the most traumatic moments of European history. And I'm just going to share the screen for a moment. I know that it's important to get a geographical fix here because some people are going to know everything I say. I have a map of Ukraine in my head. Whoops. So I'm sharing this screen, and these are the, oh boy. This is a map of Poland before World War II. The Ukrainian territories I will speak about most, which are Volhynia and Galicia, were in interwar Poland. So you see all this yellow part of Poland? All that yellow part of Poland is where Ukrainians lived. And in the north is Volhynia, and in the south is Galicia. In Ukrainian, Volyn and Halichina. Also, I'll be talking somewhat about Bukovina, which is the northern area of Romania in between the wars. Both of these territories, Galicia and Bukovina, had belonged to the Habsburg monarchy earlier. So the Wirth Institute is a good place to talk about them. Volhynia did not. It was part of the Russian Empire. Then these territories, when Hitler and Stalin made a pact in 1939, the Soviet Union took the western part, the eastern part of Poland, including Volhynia and Galicia, which they called Western Ukraine, and annexed it to the Soviet Union. And similarly, they took the northern part of Bukovina in 1940 as part of the same pact. This is a map of Ukraine during wartime. The white border is the border of the contemporary Ukrainian state, today's Ukrainian state. And the territories that I've been talking about, Volhynia is up here. It was part of the Reichskommissariat Ukraina, which was a brutal regime, absolutely brutal. I'll come back to that. District Galician, or Galicia, in the general government, was incorporated into the sort of rump Poland that the Germans had. Very different conditions there than in the north. And Bukovina was under Romanian occupation during the war. I just want to point out one thing before we go any further, which is that the northern part of Volhynia, actually almost all of Volhynia, is heavily forested. And you can see that the forest zone in Ukraine stretches from way up here, right on the Russian border, all the way across to Volhynia. And that's important because it is where partisan activity occurs, where UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, was active. So with this kind of geographical introduction, I'll continue. I'll go chapter by chapter. I think that's the way to go. So my first chapter is called Historiography. And usually historical works have some kind of historiographic introduction. I have an entire chapter, and a rather long chapter, because I'm attempting not to list all the important works, but to give an intellectual history of my topic. And also to answer the question, why it took until the 21st century for historians to understand what happened between the Ukrainian nationalists and the Jews during the Holocaust. So one of the reasons is that Histories written by the Nationalists omitted accounts of participation in the Holocaust and downplayed their connection with the Germans. So, of course, for a very long time, it was not clear what they had done. Then something happened in Holocaust studies that also obscured the place of OUN and UPA in the Holocaust. So in 1961, Raoul Hilberg wrote his magisterial work, The Destruction of the European Jews. And in it, he used German documents. Up to that time, most Holocaust historians had relied on memoirs and testimonies because they didn't have access to many German documents. But Hilberg had tons of German documents, and he then used them as a kind of gold mine or gold standard of Holocaust research. And this had a huge impact on deforming Holocaust studies, actually, because everything was being seen through the eyes of the perpetrators. And all kinds of topics were left out, like rescue, Jewish resistance, and non-German actors, for example. He mentions OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, once in his book. He doesn't know what it stood for. In the index, he just says OUN. He doesn't say Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And he defines it only as a pro-German Ukrainian organization. And of course, it's much more complicated than that. And he totally poo-pooed the use of survivor testimony and memoirs. And in the same year, 1961, Hannah Arendt wrote her Eichmann in Jerusalem book, which also totally dismissed the value of survivor testimony. Things began to change with the collapse of communism in the 1990s. The archives opened, of course. There were publications in post-Soviet Ukraine dealing with OUN and UPA, and they were using the newly opened archives to find out what happened. Diaspora memoirs as well, the Ukrainian nationalists who were living in Toronto or Winnipeg or wherever they were living, all of a sudden began writing more memoirs and more detailed memoirs. Prior to the collapse of the communist system, people were afraid to give too many details because they felt that relatives or friends of persons mentioned could be persecuted. So now we have just a lot more information. Then I would emphasize and underline the role that Jan Gross's study Neighbors, which came out in 2000, 2001, played in revising Holocaust history. And I will say Jan Gross was one of the speakers in this very Reichert series of lectures. Anyways, why is Neighbors important? Because he brought back Jewish testimony. He brought back Jewish testimony and made an important intellectual defense of the use of them. And he also concentrated on non-German actors, namely Poles who killed the Jewish population of the town of Jedwabne. So I would say that when he did that in 2000, 2001, we were on a trajectory to being able to understand the role of the nationalists in the Holocaust. And today, very interesting work on the history of the Holocaust is coming out in Ukraine by younger scholars like Yuri Radchenko, Marta Havreshko, Andrei Usach. These people are really leading the charge these days. I'll go to chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about sources. The kinds of sources I used for this book were German documents, Soviet documents, OUN documents, Jewish testimonies and memoirs, Polish accounts, Ukrainian memoirs, photographs and films, the legal and underground press during the occupation. So there's a wide variety of sources. And taken all together, all these sources point to the same narrative. Even the defensive Ukrainian memoirs by the nationalists themselves, there are silences, there are indications, everything fits into a certain narrative. And I make much use of, and I am a great defender of, the importance of using Jewish memoirs to give the victims experience. It's not enough to just say a train full of Jews went off to Sobibor and were killed. No, we have to know how they lived and how they died. We have to hear what they experienced. Victims' experience is extremely important. We know that from trials. We know that from many other historical studies. In Ukrainian studies, victims' memoirs are used for certain things, namely for the famine of 1932-33, the Holodomor, but victims' memoirs are not used to understand the history of OUN or UPA. So it's a kind of double standard. We use testimony and memoirs for our atrocity, but we don't include it for atrocities that we ourselves might commit as a group. I also deal with the problem of tainted sources in this chapter on the sources. There are many tainted sources, but the most tainted are the German documents. Hilberg loved them, but really you stop and think about it. They're the documents of murderers. Usually the documents are part of the murder process in the same way as a murderer who is planning to commit a murder. The Germans wrote down their plans. They not only wrote down their plans, they wrote what they did. The detailed accounts. They thought they were doing great things for all of humanity by killing the Jewish population. Well, you know, again, I'll bring back this question of a victim's testimony and murderer's testimony. I don't see why we would take the word of a murderer over the word of a victim. So I really think it's important to balance all these sources. Also very problematic, I've made quite a bit of use of them in the past. There's only one photograph in my book right now, but I've used a lot of photographs and films to figure out what happened. And they're very tainted sources. Every one of those pictures, well, maybe not every one, there's an exception that Wendy Lauer writes about in her book, The Ravine. But generally, these are atrocity photos taken by killers and then passed around among German soldiers who are involved on the Eastern Front. So these are also tainted sources. They like to show naked women being humiliated. They like to show people lining up to be killed. Occasionally there is shots of bodies in ravines and stuff like that. These are artifacts of murder. I also used evidence from Soviet war crime trials, and the Soviet war crime trials, which were held in the 1940s, and then later some of them were recontinued in the 70s or 80s. But Soviet war trials, war crimes trials, are also tainted by the fact that some of the evidence was coerced. You know, people with sleep deprivation, beatings, that's how they got information. Although I'll point out that none of the nationalists who were put on trial denied what their unit did or the events that occurred in their locality. What they only deny is their personal participation. So none of them deny that these things happened. So they're valuable sources, but when we use them, we have to keep in mind who and how they were obtained. Then chapter 3 is actually about the organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, UN. After World War I and the civil wars that followed, the collapse of empires, all kinds of new states appeared. Long dead countries like Poland and Lithuania appeared on the map. Countries which had never existed before, like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Latvia, Estonia, all of a sudden appeared on the map. But no Ukraine. Ukraine failed to achieve an independent state in the aftermath of the wars. And this was the most frustrating thing for all Ukrainian politicians. Well, maybe not all. There was a Soviet Ukraine, and a lot of people put their banked on that. But the failure to achieve an independent state, free of the influence of Warsaw, Moscow, or Bucharest, was traumatic. And the first commandment of the Ukrainian Nationalists Decalogue was, you will attain a Ukrainian state or die in the struggle for it. OUN was founded in 1929 in emigration, but its base was in the Ukrainian inhabited lands within Poland and Romania, the Galicia and Volhynia, which I showed on the map, and Bukovina. And from 1929 to 1939, OUN's activities were assassinations. They managed to assassinate some very spectacular, like, ministers and politicians in the Polish government. Robberies, they would rob post offices for money, banks, that kind of things. They call them exe. They're expropriations, and sabotage. They might burn a Polish field, of a field of a Polish farmer, that kind of thing. Like many movements at that time, it came under the influence of Italian fascism and German National Socialism. We often forget just how popular fascistic ideas were in the 1930s. I mean, they from Portugal, Spain, strong accent français in France, Italy was fascist, Germany was National Socialist, the Iron Guard was very powerful in Romania, the Goga government was an anti-Semitic government bordering on fascism. These kind of movements had great circulation in the 30s. And the more OUN came under the influence of National Socialist Germany, the more anti-Semitic it became. And in fact, in the late 1930s, you can find intense anti-Semitism in the publications of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. And several important OUN theorists in the years before the German invasion of the USSR advocated ethnic cleansing of the non-Ukrainian population, including Jews. Now, in 1940, OUN split into two factions, one led by Stepan Bandera, the other by Andriy Melnik. But that split doesn't necessarily have a lot to do with the story. Both OUNs had more or less the same kind of politics as far as the Holocaust went. Chapter 4, I deal with the first Soviets, as I call them, 1939 to 1941. As a result of the German-Soviet non-aggression pact of 1939, that is, the alliance between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, Germany expanded westward, but the Soviet Union expanded eastward. And among the territories it took were Eastern Poland or Western Ukraine, Galicia and Volhynia, as well as the northern part of Bukovina from Romania. These areas were under Soviet rule until the 22nd of June, 1941. Well, actually a few days later. But on the 22nd of June, 1941, Germany attacked the Soviet Union, including the newly acquired Ukrainian territories, and they disappeared. But there were 21 months in Galicia and less than that in Bukovina, in which they became Soviet territories. So it was a very brutal 21 months. So there were deportations of hundreds of thousands of people, Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, sent to the Gulag. Nationalization of even very small businesses. I've looked at the lists. I mean, there's small equivalent of convenience stores, even carts that were nationalized. Most of these were owned by Jews. It's very important that they were nationalized because a lot of them were simply expropriated altogether. Imposition of ideological conformity, emptying of stores. When the Soviets came into Galicia, they put a real low exchange rate for the ruble so that the soldiers could come in and buy anything in the store that they wanted, and they would ship it home to their families in Kostroma or wherever the families lived. They saw riches there that they'd never seen before, like cottage cheese and those kind of things. It was a period, like I say, of great repression. A lot of people kept a suitcase ready to take with them to the Gulag. You could never tell when you would be targeted. And of course, there were massive arrests of members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. But the nationalists managed to survive underground. And in fact, they not only survived the Soviet period, they expanded in their numbers. They had 20 years of underground experience in Poland. They knew exactly how to keep their heads low. And for instance, the Jewish Zionists also tried to go underground during the Soviet period, but they failed to do so very well because they had no experience. In fact, in the interwar period, the Zionists had support from the Polish government. So they were ill-equipped to survive the Soviet period. So many Zionists were sent off to the Gulag as well. Very important for the dominance of OUN during the war is that all other Ukrainian political parties, ranging from the Social Democrats to the Socialist Revolutionaries, to the monarchists, to the Democrats of the Ukrainian National Democratic Organization, UNDA, all of them dissolved themselves. The only Ukrainian political force in these regions which survived, as I say, and which now had an open field with no rivals from any other Ukrainian political group was OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. In this period, if you read the nationalist literature or talk to some of the nationalists, they'll say that, and if you certainly read the press of the time and the proclamations of the time, you'll get the impression that the Jews were the big backers of Bolshevism, of communism, and that therefore they got what they deserved because they were communists and denounced the nationalists and Ukrainians to the Soviet authorities. So I tried to test this in my book, and there's quite a long section on Jews under this 21-month occupation. I took Jews from the city of Lviv, and I took a whole series of interviews with them where they described their Soviet experience, and as well as I read other people's literature on the subject. And here's what I'll actually quote from the book here to show where the Jews stood during this period. Many Jews were ambivalent about their experience of communist rule. They may have lost their business or part of their home or lost a friend or relative to the Gulag, but they were no longer exposed to anti-Semitic attacks, whether physical or verbal, and perhaps they were able to pursue a new career or educational opportunity or otherwise climb the social hierarchy. Some lay as low as possible during this dangerous period. Others cooperated with the Soviet authorities to a greater or lesser extent with more or less enthusiasm. Some denounced their neighbors to the NKVD or even joined its ranks. What happened was complicated, and different individual experiences and actions should not be reduced to generalizations or stereotypes. I hasten to say that, in fact, the stereotypes came immediately The Jews were blamed for many of the crimes of the Soviets. The Nazis made sure of that, and the Nationalists made sure of that. And the final act of the Soviet occupation of 1939 to 41 was when the Germans attacked in June 22nd, 1941, when they attacked, the prisons were overcrowded with nationalists, Zionists, Polish intellectuals. They were just crammed full. They were not able to have deported them fast enough to keep up. And then as the Germans attacked, and it's very quickly, right? They very quickly attacked, and it was a surprise attack. The Soviets were not ready. They were unable to evacuate those prisoners, and they killed them instead. They killed about 15,000 prisoners of theirs in Galicia and Volhynia in late June 1941. So that was the Soviet period. And it sets up much of the scene for what follows. Then chapter 5 is about anti-Jewish violence in the summer of 1941. Now, the Holocaust began immediately after the Germans invaded the USSR. Some people say, well, the period until the Wannsee Conference of early 1942 is not really the Holocaust. That can only make sense if you're studying France or something like that. You're studying Eastern Europe, the Holocaust begins the moment they cross the border. And anti-Jewish violence is encouraged by the Germans, and it is also a spontaneous kind of upheaval. That all the states and all the territories that had been under Soviet rule in 1939 to 40 or 41, from the Baltic states in the north to Bukovina and Moldavia in the south, experienced anti-Jewish violence, pogroms, executions, sometimes Vietnamnik type of situations where the Germans are not even there and the local population kills its Jews, generally under nationalist influence. And in this bloody context, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the Bandera faction, proclaims a Ukrainian state on 30th of June, 1941 in the downtown in Lviv, Lvov, Lvov, Lemberg, Leopolis. We know where it is, Lviv, capital of Galicia. The Germans did not agree to a Ukrainian state, and in fact, they took the major OUN leaders and placed them under house arrest because they did not want a Ukrainian state encroaching on their Lebensraum. But, and if you read the declaration of the renewal of Ukrainian statehood from the 30th of June, 41, you'll see that there are all kinds of ministries and so on. Many Ukrainians in the region considered this state in existence until maybe, I would say, mid-August. But there was no functioning at that high level of state where there are ministries and presidents and stuff. On the other hand, OUN was able to actually construct the lower echelons of the state. That is the local civil administration in municipalities and villages in Galicia and Volhynia, generally with German approval. They would pick the mayors, they would pick the deputy mayor, they would pick the councilman and get it approved by the Germans. And at the same time, OUN established the Ukrainian National Militia, Ukrainska Narodna Militia, which was instructed, among other things, to put Jews in concentration camps, to execute certain ones of them, but the rest to put in concentration camps. But since they didn't build that upper level of the state, they were unable to build concentration camps for the Jews. And instead, some of the militias killed Jews in pogroms, the very famous Lviv pogrom of July 1st, 1941, or they rounded up Jews for the Germans or Romanians to kill, or they killed Jews in villages and small towns on their own initiative. In my book, I give a narrative of what happened in Galicia, Volhynia, and Bukovina. It's not easy reading. It's because it describes brutal and intimate killing. Drowning, beating with nails with protruding, and sticks with protruding nails, clubs, agricultural implements, mass murder. The OUN militias killed at least 15,000 Jews in these territories in July and early August 1941. Chapter 6 is about the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the police in German service. In the book, I explain the structure of the Ukrainian police forces in Galicia and Bukovina. In Galicia, which was in the general government, that is the Rump Poland, to join the Ukrainian auxiliary police, you actually had to be of Ukrainian nationality. You had to read and write in Ukrainian, and so that it was almost totally a ethnic Ukrainian force. In Volhynia, the police force was a territorial force. Where the nationalists were strong, it was largely Ukrainian police in Volhynia, because the nationalists were strong there. But elsewhere in the Reichskommissariat, there could be Russians, there could be other nationalities in the police. Yeah, I want to talk about their social composition. Generally, they were young men in their 20s, their early 20s. In some regions, the average age was about 20 of the policemen. There were some intellectuals in the police, especially in the higher ranks, and especially in a big city like Lviv. But most of the police were of peasant origin. Peasant origin in the city, sometimes from that kind of lower class urban population. People joined the police for a number of reasons. Motivations could be organizational, ideological. So OUN wanted to go into the police. They wanted to have that police power. Police were very useful for any organization. False papers, removing people from forced labor in Germany, all kinds of things could be done. Radios, things that any group that wants to be independent of the Germans needs. So it wasn't just the nationalists. There were more moderate groups that went into the police, some representatives of Prosvita, which was an adult education society. A major reason why people went into the police, peasant boys went into the police, was to avoid deportation to Germany. Germany was rounding up laborers, forced laborers. It started out with volunteers, but after a while, they began to round people up. Less in Galicia, more in Volhynia. They would do things like young people would be coming out of church or after a dance. They would just grab all those young people right where they were and send them off to Germany. No, go home and get this. No, they'd be just roped and taken off to Germany. And people joined the police in order to avoid that fate. Young people who would be the prime candidates for going to Germany. And you have to also understand how important that might have been for people in the peasant economy. With the sons going off to war, with the sons going off to forced labor, it was very important to try to keep the boys at home. And the women too, the young women too. Material incentives. If you joined the police, you got a salary that was more than that of an ordinary worker. You got extra things, you got vodka, you got cigarettes, you got flour, all kinds of things which were very scarce under the Nazi occupation. And once you got into the police, you could make a huge amount of money off the Holocaust because you could accept bribes. You could policemen were often rewarded for their work on the Jews. They would get valuables that they could take from the pockets, money that they could take from the pockets. And furniture was often distributed to the police after mass murders of the Jews. So there was more material in incentives. And of course, there's some people who just like the exercise of power and violence. And the power and violence which the police was able to commit was unrestrained under the Nazi occupation. Sexual violence, physical violence, robbery, all of that was just fair game. And one thing I do also in the book is I compare the Ukrainian police force with the Jewish police, the Ordnungsdienst. And I show that many of the same patterns we see in the Ukrainian police, we also find in the Jewish police. It's kind of a template of how the police has to function in a Holocaust and a genocide. So what did the Ukrainian police do vis-a-vis the Jewish population? Well, they implemented the transfer of Jews to the ghettos. Sometimes this was occasion for robbery and murder. Sometimes the elderly were just shot as they were being transferred to the ghetto because they were going too slow. The police guarded the perimeter of the ghetto. Jewish police were inside the ghetto, Ukrainian police on the perimeter of the ghetto. Ukrainian police guarded Jewish forced laborers because any municipality could just simply force Jews to do any work they wanted, construction work, cleanup work. Often policemen were seconded to labor camps, to forced Jewish labor camps. But their largest contribution to the Holocaust, and the main reason that these forces were even designed and established in the first place, was for the final liquidation of the Jewish population. The job of the police was to convey Jews to execution. During the mass liquidation of the ghettos and other clusters of Jewish population in 1942 and early 1943, when the Holocaust became ever more systematic. The Germans, especially the Einsatzgruppen, were the main shooters, but the police also took part sometimes. And the more I read, the more I see the police are taking part. But what did the police have to do with OUN, with the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists? What was the influence of OUN in the police? Well, first of all, many of the militiamen who were responsible for the anti-Jewish violence of July and early August 1941, many of these OUN militiamen went into the police. Also, OUN infiltrated the police deliberately. Outside of Galicia and Volhynia, they asked people in Galicia for every 10 youth that one of them should be sent to be a policeman in Eastern Ukraine. So they were very interested in being in the police. And not only was OUN present in the police, but they also recruited in the police. In Rovno, the police school had to be closed because Ukrainian nationalists had taken over and were teaching the police their ideology and not the proper Nazified materials. And then in spring of 1943, thousands of these policemen deserted to OUN's armed force, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA. So many of the officers of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army were former policemen with lots of blood on their hand already. In the last chapter, it's chapter 7, I talk about the fate of the Jews in the Ukrainian nationalist insurgency. And here I have to say a little bit about the situation in Volhynia. Volhynia, different than Galicia, was in the Reichskommissariat Ukraine. The difference between these two administrations was tremendous. In Galicia, Ukrainians could get some education. They could go to post-secondary school. There were even scholarships for Ukrainians to go study abroad in places like Prague and Berlin. In the Reichskommissariat, you could only have a fourth grade education. That was it. You had to know enough to get out of the way of the German trucks when you were across the street. Rationing of food was very low for Ukrainians. Deliberate policy of starvation of the cities. Roundups of youth, as I say, you'd come out of church and the next thing you knew, somebody threw a lasso on you or something like that. So you had to be really, really, really careful. It was very bloody, the brutalities of the Nazi regime, not only against the Jewish population of the Reichskommissariat, but against the Ukrainian population as well, and the Russian population that was there. And this led, by the end of 1942, beginning of 1943, to both spontaneous resistance. The locals would try to stop the deportation of the kids, or they would do other things which would harm the Germans in their activities. And also, not just spontaneous outbursts of anti-German resistance, but the Soviets were coming in, the red partisans were coming into Volhynia from the north. Remember, I showed at the beginning a map with the forest region going all the way from the east into the west. Well, that's the route the Soviet partisans followed, and they went into, as they approached Volhynia. And more sympathies in this region were going towards the Soviet partisans, because the Soviet partisans would deliver them from the Germans. I should also point out that Volhynia, before World War II, had a strong communist movement. And the presence of the Germans and the Soviet partisans revived pro-communist sympathies among parts of the population. So the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, which had been cooperating in various ways with the Germans, had to launch an anti-German insurgency or risk losing the loyalty of the local population. Hitherto, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists had been closely associated with the Germans through its pervasive presence in the civil administration and the police forces, both of which served the Germans. So, to undo the damage, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists decided to have an insurgency against the Germans. But it was a calibrated insurgency. They would break up roundups of Ukrainians for forced labor to maintain the support of the population. They would ambush occasional German patrols, but they would not derail trains, German supply trains, going to the Eastern Front, because Aoun was happy to have the Wehrmacht fighting against the Red Army. For them, the Red Army was the main enemy. Also, there are no recorded incidents of the liberation of Jewish forced labor camps by Aoun in their anti-German insurgency. And at the same time, they were now, since they had this insurgency going on in Volhynia, they were now free of the need to take German wishes into consideration. They didn't have to just kill Jews. They could kill anybody they perceived as an enemy. So they launched an ethnic cleansing operation in Volhynia that aimed at removing all non-Ukrainian minorities, not just Jews. The major target was the Polish population, but many other non-Ukrainians were killed, including Roma and ethnic Germans. Jews, who are now hiding in the forests after the liquidations of 42, 43, were also targeted. Realizing that the Germans were going to lose the war, OUN and UPA tried to reach out to the Western Allies and issued a new program that guaranteed protection to national minorities, including Jews. But this was only for show. At the same time as a new turn came in their politics, in August 1943, UPA was engaged in intense killing of Poles and Jews. In fact, July had more killings, but August was almost equal to July. These were the height of the killings of non-Ukrainians when they were issuing this program of national minority rights. And UPA and OUN killed Jews for a number of reasons. They targeted them. One thing was OUN has vehement anti-Semitism, particularly the conviction that the Jews were carriers of Bolshevism. There were the presence of the numerous policemen in UPA officer ranks who were used to killing Jews and who did not want any witnesses to their previous crimes when the Soviets returned. Jews sometimes often fled for protection to the Poles because they were both targeted groups by the Ukrainian nationalists. And then therefore, when the OUN was killing, or UPA was killing the Poles, they would kill the Jews who were there with them as well. Jews often sought the protection of Red partisans to protect them against the Germans and the Ukrainians. And that was another reason to kill the Jews, because they were demonstrating their pro-communism. Moreover, the Jews were important human capital for the Soviets. One of the things that happened during the Holocaust was that there was a shortage of craftsmen. Most of the craftsmen in Volhynia were Jews. They were the tailors, they were the harness makers, they were the mechanics, they were all those professions. Now, when you kill them, there's a shortage. And those Jews who survived would go to the Soviets and they could work on leather and work on other things which are important for the campaign. And also, as the Soviets closed in, UPA exhibited a general paranoia, not just against Jews who might turn them in or betray them or go to the Soviets, but Eastern Ukrainians who were in their ranks were murdered. The Russians who were in their ranks, because there were some Russians in UPA, they were murdered. And POWs working in the villages were murdered, all because OUN feared what would happen if the Soviets came in and these people were still around. So it's preventive murder, just like the Soviets did in late June 1941, when they killed the prisoners. So OUN went through this paranoid moment where it was just killing. And UPA issued orders to kill all Jews and to kill any Ukrainians who hid Jews. Another interesting thing that happened in this period was that UPA set up labor camps for Jews, just like the Germans had done. They registered them, they counted them, but as the Soviet partisans and Red Army approached in the winter of 43-44, they killed the Jews that were in their labor camps. Some Jews served in UPA as physicians, and some of them survived. Some were killed by UPA. Some were repressed by the Soviets. We don't know what proportion of what occurred. And finally, I would like to say on the national insurgency that UPA resistance was not like the Polish anti-German resistance, the Armia Krajowa, in that the Armia Krajowa had a special branch, underground branch of aid to the Jews, so-called Żegota, which was a very important source of aid to the persecuted Jews. OUN had nothing like that. And as Ivan Lysyaklinitsky, the great Ukrainian historian who was at our university in Alberta, said, OUN never even put out a proclamation condemning the murder of the Jews. Well, of course, they were totally implicated in it. So that's what my book is about. I know that I'm just kind of giving shorthand, this and that, but maybe I can explain things in a little bit more detail in a discussion. I think I've left half an hour. Thank you for your attention.
Bravo. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, you'll have to imagine 179 people applauding. Well, this is wonderful. And, you know, I hope you don't mind me saying this is really wonderful and compelling doing of history. That is, it's so finely grained, but it's in the service of a much bigger, a rich and much bigger picture, and it contributes, as far as I can tell, contributes in a really meaningful way to the understanding of the Holocaust as this very layered and multifaceted business. As you said early in your talk, apropos of something else, what happened was complicated, which I thought is a beautiful phrase, and it captures so much of this. And as you say too, everything has come around quite nicely. As you say, this is not an indictment of a nation or a people, but a contribution to the understanding that there's an awful lot going on if we think about how Holocaust history is done, and sometimes it's done in a rather simple way, if I can say as much. You know, that we have this sense of this is something that the Germans perpetrated, and it happens sort of primarily in Poland, and you have these sort of few sort of major sites, but this kind of history demonstrates the complexity and the extension of all of these tentacles into the, you know, the sort of the farthest reaches of Europe, and it's especially complex, obviously, in Eastern Europe. If there's a few questions in the Q&A, if you'll indulge me, I'll ask two to start, if that's okay. And they're both quite naive, I think. And one, I wondered if you would just address. You said at one point, this relates to when you're talking about the police and police killings, especially. Some people just like violence, and I think, I mean, you've described what's in your book, summarized it in a fairly delicate way. I wondered if you'd speak at all to how you cope with that as a historian, and dealing with this sort of material as you do.
Well, first of all, I say that it's not easy. On the one hand, there's a problem that I got a lot of pushback from some Ukrainians over this work, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. Reading about all these murders is just horrific. Every Holocaust scholar has nightmares. And I certainly had my share of them. I mean, the things that people did, and you know, it's not just my own research. I had to read widely in the Holocaust literature in order to write this book. It's what people can do to one another, you know. And then I go in the morning, I read the news, and I think, they're still doing it. Just terrible. So how do I cope with that? Well, that's why God invented wine, I think.
Fair enough. Thank you. And so the other naive question that I want to ask is, you know, this endlessly circulating concept. You mentioned Hannah Arendt. You know, this idea of the banality of evil. Does that apply, you know, specifically in the context when you're talking about the police and the fact that you have all of these, you know, young men, which is itself there's an interesting question about age and class as sort of drivers of the Holocaust. But joining for the salary, for the perks, to avoid deportation, and then this cascades into sort of increasing incentivized violence against the Jews. Is this does this fit under this umbrella of the banality of evil?
I don't know. I didn't think in Arendt's case, she's looking at a bureaucrat who's sitting in an office, and occasionally he goes out into the field, but not really into the killing fields. And in that way, it's banal. It's just it's a person who manages train schedules and figures out how to do one thing or another. In that sense, she's talking about banality. This is, and this is the kind of that banality of evil, the bureaucratization, is very important in Hilberg's book, and also in another brilliant classic, but flawed classic, Zygmunt Bauman's Holocaust and Modernity, where he also deals with this as a bureaucratized process. But when you get to the Ukrainian territories, there is some bureaucracy, of course. You're sending one group to another, but also it's very intimate killing, and it's a bit of a Wild West. So there was a Waffen SS unit, Viking. It was meant to be, for Vikings, Scandinavians, but there are many Germans in it as well. There were different units. This unit developed a real taste for blood, and they just went on rampages, these horrific rampages. In one case in Remalio, in a little town, they gave out guns to kids to shoot Jews, to get them involved. They thought that was great fun. And they didn't have any special writ or they weren't in Einsatzgruppe. It just became part of the culture of that unit to search for blood. They did a huge massacre. First, the Ukrainian kids wouldn't shoot the Jews, but then a German showed them how, and they went on with it. So it's very intimate. They knew who they were killing. Then they drove them off to a bridge and threw them in the Jews in the river. And there they died, and they shot them as they were in the water, and then the whole town stunk for days because it was summertime. So, it's very different than bureaucratization. It's very different than, you smell it, you see it, you hear the screams. Every sense is pervaded by it. It's very different than the banality that Arendt was talking about. You have to remember that in Eastern Europe, or the Soviet territories in particular, in Ukraine, very few Ukrainians were sent to death camps. And very few Ukrainian Jews were sent to death camps. Only some of the Jews, maybe half the Jews of Galicia, were sent to Belzec, or Belzec as people call it, a death camp. But most of them were just shot in their neighborhoods. So, and people had to get used to it. So, you have accounts. Jeffrey Bird's a very important scholar of these questions, found a document where a young policeman had to shoot girls he used to go to parties with. And he found it very difficult to do. And an older policeman showed him how. Said, you lay him down and you shoot him. And he got used to it, and eventually became a serial killer. Another guy, later in life, he so repented for what he did. But he said, when I was killing, I was like a beast. It just didn't mean anything to me. I would get drunk all the time. I just kill people. I once traveled 7 miles to kill a Jewish physician that I knew was alive. So it was very difficult for, and the concept of the bystander. How are you a bystander in a situation like this? Anyways, so I think that kind of answers that question, or my attempt to answer it.
Yeah, no, absolutely it does. I appreciate it. Thank you. I'll go to the Q&A now, and we'll see how that goes. The first question in the Q&A: are there plans to publish your most recent book in Ukrainian?
Well, that's under negotiation. In fact, there have been several. I didn't think I would have any chance of having that book published in Ukrainian translation. Certainly not by that presses that I'm familiar with. But there have been negotiations with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, which is a left-wing publisher, but there are many restrictions on what they would do with it. Like you couldn't sell it in a bookstore. But just today I got an email. With one suggesting one institution that would both publish it and pay for the translation. So we'll see. There's also negotiations for a Russian translation in a reputable Russian press, not in one of these Putinesque type of places.
Well, I guess now, since you mentioned Russia, this is a question. When you speak about historiography, do you analyze what has been written in Russian?
Yes, of course.
Fair enough. To what extent were the Ukrainian nationalists involved in the Holocaust by bullets?
Well, the Holocaust by bullets was the main way of Jews died in Ukraine was the Holocaust by bullets, when the Einsatzgruppen went systematically killing their communities. They were involved because they were in the police. So they're not directly involved in those mass murders of the Holocaust by bullets because the police is not under formal OUN control. But I try to tease that out in the book, that it's indirect. Many of the people who are involved in these murders are OUN and they go into UPA, or they're not OUN, but they still go into UPA. So the police were the main ones in the Holocaust by bullets. What happened later, let's say during the national insurgency, when UPA was active, the armed force, in say 43 and early 44, there was no Holocaust by bullets there. It was a matter of finding Jewish bunkers in the woods. And in 1941, in the summer of 41, it wasn't quite the Holocaust by bullets yet. There were mass killings, but it was only gearing up to what would happen. Well, in August, there was killing about over 20,000 Jews in a day or two it's escaping me where it occurred, and then of course Babi Yar was in September of 1941, and that was 33,000 Jews. So the nationalists were involved probably in all these mass murders, but conveying the Jews to their point of execution, occasionally shooting, perhaps finishing off people who still moved afterwards. And they were also, they were often rewarded for their work as kind of militiamen.
Thank you. The next question. Some claim there's been an attempt to displace blame for the Holocaust from Nazi Germany onto Eastern Europeans. Is this a valid concern?
You know, the Holocaust, as you said, Alex, is a really complicated thing. There's no question in my mind that what happened would not have happened if it had not been for the Nazis coming to power in Germany and then their invasion of the Soviet Union. That's the key to everything. That's the key to everything. I don't think the Germans are trying to displace blame, because in fact, German historians are always emphasizing the German aspects to the neglect of other non-German actors. So I don't see this happening. I mean, Poland and its current government, there's a strong kind of tendency to imagine that Poland is being blamed for the Holocaust, because of Jan Gross's book Neighbors, and because the camps were often located on the death camps, all the death camps were located on Polish soil. They feel there's a displacement, but it's the stuff of which conspiracy theories are made out of. It's far-fetched. You have to look at the facts on the ground. Certainly the Germans are the absolutely most responsible for the Holocaust. Absolutely. No question. But they could not have done what they did without local help. They were so overextended. Like, just think about it. End of 1942. Where were the Germans? They had occupied part of France. They had Vichy France as their ally. They had allies all the way through their own territory. They had allies in Romania, allies in Hungary, and they extended themselves all the way to the gates of Moscow and the siege of Leningrad. That's a huge territory. They could not have done what they did without interacting with the local population. And I want to say another thing, as long as you brought this interesting topic up. Where there were no nationalists, the Germans still succeeded in their program, because people would come aboard for other reasons in the Holocaust. So even former Soviet officials would sometimes want to now join the new administration because they didn't want to decline in their social status. There are all kinds of, and the material incentives which worked in Galicia and Volhynia worked really well in Donbass and other places. So, there were, Dieter Paul, a German historian who wrote about Galicia, said that whatever the local population did, it really didn't matter. It would still have happened. So knowing that that's the case, but also seeing what various organizations chose to do during this period, it's important for Ukrainian history to get it straight, get the Holocaust in Ukraine straight. Holocaust was a major thing in Ukrainian history. The fact that most of the towns and cities, small towns and cities in Western Ukraine, and not just in Galicia and Volhynia, but in much of the West, that they're Ukrainian speaking or they're Russian speaking today, is because the Jewish population, which could have made half or a third of the population of these cities, is gone. The apartments that they had are taken over by other locals. The wealth that they had was transferred partially to the Germans and partially to the locals. So it's a big thing, and blame, I think, is not what's really important. Finding out what happened is what's really important.
Thank you. A very different question, but a really interesting one, I think. Can you talk a little more about your experience of the archival work involved? Did you face any challenges accessing sources? It's not a pretty history. Did you find resistance or roadblocks to accessing this sensitive material?
Yeah, I found roadblocks in Ukraine. I was sometimes not well, yeah, sometimes I was blocked, but I don't think that's did me any harm, because we live in a digital age, and I write about this in sources. When I started, back in the 1300s, when I started as a historian doing my research, I had to go to individual archives. I couldn't photocopy them in the Soviet Union or Poland. I had to do it all by hand. And if I wanted to research, I had to go from one place to another place to another place. So like for my dissertation, I worked mainly in Vienna, Krakow, and Lviv and Kyiv and Leningrad for my dissertation. Nowadays, I have most of this stuff exists all over the place. So I had a 3-month scholarship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. They've made microfilms of all the most important documents from Ukraine. And they had expert advice on what to photograph. And when I first went there in 2009, I was kind of scanning page by page what I needed. But now you go there and you can take a USB drive, stick it in there, and in 20 minutes, you'll have 20 volumes, or maybe not 20 volumes of Soviet war crimes trials. It's not something that I had. I have about 7,500 Jewish testimonies on my external hard drive downstairs. I have numerous, the Nationalists have put all kinds of documents online. I can consult them there. Jewish organizations have put up, Jewish genealogical organization, Jewish Gen, have put up numerous translations of Yizkor books. Those are memory books from individual localities, many of them from Ukraine. All this stuff is accessible from your study. It's a totally different universe. So going after, I will say this, I didn't have access to local records, but I see these young historians in Ukraine with the access to local records, and they're just doing path-breaking work. My thing takes like all the kinds of sources and shows how they all fit into one narrative. But there are many more sources out there. I'll continue for just a second here. To get the Jewish testimonies, I used 4 main sources. I used testimonies collected mainly immediately after World War II by the Central Jewish Historical Commission. I used the video recordings by the USC Shoah Foundation, which is sponsored by Steven Spielberg. I used all the memoirs that are published that are kept by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum Library, and all the Yizkor books that are translated into English. But there's all kinds of other repositories of Jewish testimonies. I thought 4 would be enough for me. But you could go back in and look at it again and check the stories. So there's materials all over the place now, and our digital age makes it possible to not have to travel to every archive. I just want to start and finish this comment with an anecdote. Back in the day, Professor Taras Hunchak, a Ukrainian historian, microfilmed what he thought were the complete records of the Germans vis-a-vis Ukraine during World War II, and many other collections on 20th century Ukrainian history. And he said to me, no one will have to travel to Berlin or Ludwigsburg or anything anymore, because they can all study it in my basement here in New Jersey. Well, which would you rather do? Go to Vienna or go to his basement in New Jersey? So, but right now, and I could finish my book during COVID because of the availability of these sources online.
Great. I just got back from Vienna last weekend, so I can say in an unqualified way, Vienna, busy. But this is, I mean, this is what a wonderful, a great question that precipitated a really terrific answer. It makes it very clear, if it isn't clear to all of us, that you know, history is a living thing, and that it's never this work. Notwithstanding the enormous dent you've put in it, that this work just goes on and on and on. And fantastic. If I can, I'll do my best here, because there's a series of questions that all seem to me to be asking the same thing. There's at least three, and they're sort of, if I can, with apologies to the questioners, they're asking in a general kind of way for you to comment on this idea of the contemporary glorification or of OUN and OPA in the Ukraine and in Canada also. Ukrainian cultural organizations in Canada, in the Ukraine itself. Is that something that you could comment on?
Yes, I can. And the strong influence of OUN here in Canada is because after World War II, many Ukrainians left Ukraine, and many of those who left, particularly those who were of the kind of chattering and thinking classes, had been involved in either the civil administration, propaganda, or in OUN, or in the Waffen-SS division Galician. So that's kind of a concentration of people who would be inclined to view OUN and UPA as heroes. In Ukraine itself, I have a more complex analysis, so I'll give it. In Galicia, the circumstances, as I said, were much better for Ukrainians. The Germans used the Ukrainians against the Poles, you know, the divide et impera strategy. So Ukrainians were treated better than the Poles in the general government, which was the Rump Poland. And their experience there was, as I say, they could go abroad to study, and where they could read actually not a bad newspaper, Krakiwski Visti, which had many prominent intellectuals writing for it. Their experience of the German occupation was, as Ukrainians, not so bad. I mean, the Jews suffered terribly, but the Ukrainians themselves didn't. Not anywhere near like the Jews or like any Ukrainian elsewhere under German occupation, under Reichskommissariat. For the Galicians, the only real terror of the war was the Soviet occupation of 1939 to 41, including the mass murder by the NKVD of the Ukrainian political prisoners, and the Soviet reconquest of 1944, where they were confronted with the UPA's insurgency against them, and fought against it for, they fought for about 5 years before the insurgency was quelled by the Soviets. And in the quelling of the insurgency, the Soviets used absolutely brutal methods. Absolutely. So one would be, to take all the family members and acquaintances of an identified insurgent and ship them off to Kazakhstan or Siberia. Or here's what they did very often. This is a terrible story I'm going to tell you. They would kill insurgents, and then they'd take them to the village where they thought they might live, and they would force the population to go by and look at them and identify them. And if your own son was there, you wouldn't identify him because you didn't want you didn't want to reveal secrets to the enemy. So for the Galicians, who form, by the way, the vast majority of Ukrainians in Canada, the war was not about how bad the Nazis were, but how bad the Soviets were. In the Reichskommissariat Ukraine, the war was the Germans totally discredited themselves, and they perceived the Soviet reconquest as a liberation. So in Ukraine, there's a division between kind of ethno-nationalists and let's call them post-Soviets. In every election, about half votes one side and the other half votes the other side. In order to get the votes of the ethno-nationalists, you have to court Galicia. And to court Galicia, you have to honor O'un and Upa. So it's just politics. I think we're coming to the end, if I'm not mistaken.
We are. It's 5:30. Oh my goodness. There are a total of 42 questions and comments in the Q&A. We didn't get anywhere near to the end. What I did gloss over, Professor, are a number of very kind comments, thanking you for your work, for your presentation. People who appreciated very much that you started with the maps to provide sort of a context for everything, and a number of very effusively friendly comments about your research, and gratitude for sharing it. And I'll echo those commentators, if you don't mind. We're very grateful. This has been a wonderful experience. And on behalf of the Wirth Institute, thank you very much for it.
Thank you very much. And thank you all who were listening to me. Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.